Starting now the Maimer Alpayim Shana Kdama Torah L'Olam that the Rebbe said on the second day of Shavuos Tafshin Yud Aleph. Just as a small, quick introduction to the general idea, the Shavuos Mamarim by the Rebbe, there were three times that there were Mamarim for Shavuos. One was from Tafshin Yud Aleph already, and that went on throughout the years. It was always the same, that there was a Fabreng in the second day of Shavuos that the Rebbe would make. And by that Fabreng, the Rebbe would generally say a Maimer. In later years, that Maimer also included something from each one of the Rabbeim, starting the Baal Shem Tov, and later on even more, etc. That was the Shavuos Maimer. That was one thing that was always. In addition to that, starting from later on, I think Tafshin Yud Beis already, until Tafshin Lamed 1970, and that was the last one, was Tafshin Lamed 1970, that the Rebbe would say a Maimer, also Shavuos morning. Shavuos morning, before leaving 770, the Rebbe was up then in 770, because the Rebbe ate by the Frierdiker Rebbe's apartment, and in the morning the Rebbe would come down at the time of Matan Torah, towards dawn, towards morning time, the time the Torah was given, the Rebbe would say a Maimer. Later, there also began, essentially when there wasn't any more the Maimer of the first night, morning of Shavuos, then the Rebbe would say a Maimer. Many times there was a Fabreng in Erev Shavuos, the night of Erev Shavuos, which is the time of Nasa v'Nishma, the time that the Jewish people said Nasa v'Nishma, and the Rebbe said a Maimer then in connection to that. This is the general Mamar of Shavuos. This year, Tafshin Yud Aleph, there was a Maimer once, the second day of Shavuos. Now, general also, the Shavuos Mamarim, very often, they speak about the greatness of Torah, they speak about the concept of giving the Torah down here, and various times it has a lot of very intricate details of Chassidus. This particular Maimer talks about the greatness of Torah, and how Torah is beyond the world, above the world, and even more so, after how great Torah is, even more the fact that Torah comes into the world. So let's go to the Maimer. And the Maimer starts with the words Alpayim Shana Kdama Torah L'Olam. It's the words of the Medrash, that the Torah preceded the world by 2,000 years. And the Medrash brings a proof from a pasuk in Mishlei that it says, V'eye shashuim yoim yoim. The Torah says that I was a pleasurable pastime, so to speak, of Hashem, something with which Hashem took pleasure, yoim yoim, day and day. What does it mean, day and day? 2 days. And the day of Hashem we know is yoim echad, elef shana meinach yemes mulki aver. 1,000 years is the day of Hashem. Yoim yoim, 2 days, 2,000 years. Now the Rebbe over here quotes a Maimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is also in various other Mamorim, in which the question is asked, how can we say that the Torah is 2,000 years before the world? Before the world there was not even a concept of time. And the Rebbe first begins by bringing over here, it's a very interesting thing, the Rebbe goes into a whole discussion of what the real question is. And we're going to try also and understand perhaps what the idea the Rebbe is bringing over here. The Rebbe brings the follows. Seemingly, you can ask a question, and this is a question which is brought down in the philosophy, in the books of the Jewish philosophers of the Gedolei Yisrael who wrote Sfarim on Chakira, and their question is, how can you say that the Torah is 2,000 years before the world? The whole concept of time that we have, as we have it, is measured by the sun, the moon, and the stars, the various constellations. Before they were created, there's nothing with which to measure time. What does it mean, a year? 2,000 years? What's a year? There's no sun. The sun is... A year means the orbit of the sun around the earth, 365 days. But if there's no days, there's no time, there's nothing with which to measure time. So the Rebbe says that question is not such a strong question. There's an answer to that question, which is, once time was created, if we go back and measure what the time would have been based on the measurements that we have today, it would have been that amount of time. It's like if a person would say, we don't have with what to measure it, but if we would have used these measuring tools, we would have had 2,000 years. The Rebbe then goes on that the question in essence is deeper. Because before the world was created, there was nothing. There was not only not a point of reference for time, but there wasn't either a point of reference of anything. Which means, say we wouldn't have the sun and the moon. We don't have all the different planets with which to measure time. So we say, but that's the essential measurement of what time would be. But what does time mean? Time is something gets older, it becomes either better or worse. It either goes up in time, it either becomes better in time, or it becomes ruined, becomes lesser as time goes by. But here we're talking about there is nothing. Nothing was created yet. There was nothing with which to get better or worse. There's only the Torah. The Torah is nitzchi. The Torah is something that's eternal. The Torah is something that can't be measured even if we were to have the measurements of time. Even if we're saying it has nothing to do with the sun and the moon, but the concept of Torah is something which is eternal, and there's nothing else in the world to say that it's older and therefore gets better or gets worse based on the passage of time. You have wine, and it sits for an amount of time. Since it was squeezed from the grapes, there's something that's there, it gets better with time. You have milk. It sits for an amount of time. Since it was milked from the cow, it gets sour with time. If there's nothing there except for the Torah, there's nothing that can get better or worse from time. That's the second question. And the Rebbe says that in essence, this is also not such a strong question, because in the end of the day, it's true that Torah is eternal, Torah is above and beyond the world, but here we're talking in relation to the world. In relation to the world that was later created, there is still some type of concept that we can say what the time was. So that's not the question that the Frierdiker Rebbe asks in his Maimer, because that question also has an answer. Because in the end of the day, once there is a world which now exists, it already is going to be something that we can talk about the connection that it has. The fact is, it has some type of thing with which it has some type of connection to the idea of time. Now the Rebbe says that the Frierdiker Rebbe's question is a different one. The Frierdiker Rebbe's question is that time was something that was created. Now the other Sfarim don't mention necessarily that question because there's an argument whether time is something that was created or not. Chassidus takes on the opinion and takes it as a simple thing that everything in the world was created, including time. When Hashem created the world, He also created the concept of time. There was no past, there was no present, there was no future. So it's not only that past, present, and future don't affect the Torah, and therefore you can't talk about Torah being above worlds in concepts of time, but more than that, past, present, and future don't exist. Past, present, and future are all equal, they're all together. So you can't talk about Torah being 2,000 years before the world was created, because when there was no world, there was also no time, there was no past, present, and future. Before we go on to Frierdiker Rebbe's explanation of what it means, let's try and understand a little bit of perhaps what the Rebbe is getting at with all these three examples and explaining what the question is. In the question itself, the idea and the concept that we're saying is that Torah is above the world. Torah is beyond the world. Torah is something that the world doesn't change it, and that it's something which isn't even within the realms of the world. Now, when we talk about things being connected or not connected to something, there's three ways that we can deal with it. There's something called Yediyas HaChiyuv. Yediyas HaChiyuv means there's something that is. When I say something is beyond something else, for example, if I say that something is so deep that I can't understand it. It's called Yediyas HaChiyuv. Yediyas HaChiyuv means I do understand it. When it's above Yediyas HaChiyuv, that would be the first question, that it's so deep that I'm not able to understand it. Then there's something which is called Yediyas HaShlila. Yediyas HaShlila means when I know something in a way of how it's removed from my grasp. For example, like the example it brings in Tanya, if someone says about Dvar Seichel, an intellectual concept, and says, I can't feel it with my hands. I can't feel it. It's a joke. Feeling and intellect aren't things that are within, that are spoken together. They're two separate things totally. That's what we call Yediyas HaShlila. And then there's something that's even beyond that. And so let's look at these three concepts that the Rebbe brings over here. Number one is, the question that's asked is, how can you say that Torah was created before the world if there aren't the tools with which to measure time? Which means, when there are the tools with which to measure time, that's regular time. That's time the way we see time as we know it. But before the world was created, you couldn't have said that Torah was 2,000 years because we don't have the tools with which to measure the years. That's level A of explaining that Torah is above and beyond because it's something which is before the world. It's something which isn't limited in the physical limitation of the world. Then we go to step 2, and we say it's not just that. Even beyond that concept, even if you're going to tell me, fine, we didn't have the actual tools to measure it then, but later on you get the tools to measure it, which means there's still some type of connection over here between Torah and time. But let's go to stage 2, that we say not only we don't have the tools with which to measure time, and this is what we would call Yediyas HaShlila, nothing else exists. And if nothing else exists, that means you can't even conceptually put Torah into the idea of time, because time means, even if you're going to measure time, it means that there's changes. There's no changes in Torah. So the Rebbe says, but even this, that still makes Torah have some type of connection to the world, because that's what we're saying, the idea of Shlila, like that. It's not connected to the idea of time, but we're still seeing where it's not connected. The third aspect, which that's what the Frierdiker Rebbe is asking in the Maimer, is that there's actually no connection whatsoever, because time doesn't exist, just like nothing else exists. Time doesn't exist at all, which means the whole concept of time totally doesn't exist. What's the point of what we're saying over here in the beginning of the Maimer? Because before we come and start talking in the Maimer about the greatness of Torah, and about how great Torah is in its place that's above the world, in its place in godliness. And not only that, but Torah goes even greater, that it's able to come into the world, and in fact that's where the essence of Torah is, where it's in the world. We first establishing what's the whole aspect and what's the whole idea of Torah, that Torah is not just far removed from the physical world, beyond the physical world. Which means something when a person is receiving the Torah on Shavuos, when a person is learning Torah, when a person is doing the mitzvahs. Torah is not just something that actually controls the physical world. Torah is not just something that is in its essence is beyond the world. Its essence is something that the whole concept of world doesn't exist. This is Torah, this is one with Hashem, beyond even the whole concept of time. There's no past, present, and future. This is something which is beyond any of that. So it's not just beyond being able to measure it within the physical measurements of the world, which is time. It's not just beyond being able to connect it to something that connects to the physical world, as in there's changes in it. Because there's no changes in Torah. It's something which in its essence comes from a space, so to speak, beyond time and space. So what the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in the Maimer is that what do we mean when we say Alpיים Shana Kdama Torah L'Olam? Alpיים Shana is actually levels. We're talking about how far removed Torah is from the aspects of our physical and even spiritual world. in the sense of where it's above it. Just like when you talk about before doesn't always mean in time, and not even in space. But before means the level that's above it, the level that's higher than it. And that, if you could ever explain, the Alpayim means 2 Elefs. Alefcha Chachma and Alefcha Bina. Alefcha Chachma is a pasuk in Eov, and Alefcha Bina is actually a continuation on the idea of that pasuk, meaning I'll teach you Chachma and Bina, saying that Torah, whilst the world is connected to the midas, the emotional attributes, the Torah is connected to intellectual attributes which are above the world, which is something which Be'ezus Hashem will continue to explain next time.